Hey there. Welcome to Ouachita Parish History with Dara. I'm so glad you've joined me. Today, we are going to finish our study of Don Juan Filhiol, and we're going to look at some of his excerpts from Poste du Ouachita that was written by Russ E. Williams Jr., and we're going to look at some of the more just things that Don Juan Filhiol wrote about the area. He wrote a ton of letters. And maybe at some point I'll get a hold of some of those because there's a lot of them that are available. And maybe we'll read some of them and just kind of laugh at some of the things he said. But it's very interesting to hear how he describes our area. If you're from our area, you will notice some things that sound really familiar, and it'll be like what the Bible says, how there's nothing new under the sun. You'll go, that sounds like that's still happening. So anyway, we'll jump right into this, and we will look at some of these, some more of the history of Don Juan Filhiol. So it has often been asserted that Don Juan Filhiol carefully inspected the bluff known as the Prairie des Canots in passing, and he noted the many advantages that the area offered as a settlement location. Filhiol went on upriver to the Ecor Fabri, presently known as Camden, Arkansas, to a trading post of long standing, and he established his own enterprise. Because remember, from the previous video, he was also going to trade with the Native Americans that were here. It has been speculated that he remained there for 2 years, leaving the area because the area was susceptible to flooding. However, this region seldom floods in the most severe rainy season. Thus, Filhiol must have decided to descend the river to the Canots Prairie for a different reason. Since he had infringed upon the older traders' territory, so when he moved there, he started becoming a trader, but there were already people who were established there. And so it says Filhiol must have been opposed by them for economic reasons. This added to the announcement that he was to create a new command post and be the commander over it, must have placed him in a difficult situation. Probably finding himself challenged over his trader standing and his governmental authority, he probably decided that it would be best to locate his command post on a site that was more evenly distanced, the midpoint, from one end to the other of the lengthy area of his jurisdiction. Prairie des Canots offered several advantages as a command center. It was centrally located, and it too was a well-established site, as the Indians had gathered there for incalculable years for trade and ceremony. Perhaps at one time it had been a campsite of the extinct Ouachita Indians. By 1785, Filhiol had completely usurped the Indians' rights to the land and had a Spanish grant to the acreage on both sides of the river. Filhiol was at the Canots Prairie when his commission as commandant arrived in February 1783. As he wrote on April 21st, 1800, I believe to have fixed myself in the place well situated as the most appropriate for all parties. His command commenced on January 29th, 1783, but his commission carried the date February 1st, 1783. The orders accompanying the commission were vast. He was to create amicable relations with the neighboring commands at Natchitoches and Arkansas and Avoyelles, create good relations with the Indians, keep the English out and the Americans and the vagabonds, oversee commerce with the Indian tribes, supervise the varied men who would trade with the Indians. Oh, we got some little bug. Create the scattered inhabitants into settlements, provide guidance for the hunters, encourage agriculture, regulate the drinking habits of the post inhabitants, and bring the entire Ouachita Valley into subordination. That is some big, tall orders for him. So, in his letter to Governor Esteban Miro, who Fort Miro is named after, of April 7th, 1783, Filhiol said that his first object after his arrival had been to prepare for the success of his assignment by any means employable in establishing order and a normal routine. Initially, Filhiol didn't know what geographic area his command encompassed. He was instructed to write a detailed account of the terrain, but did not do so until boundaries were formulated. So after the establishment of his domain, whatever it was, he was to institute all facets of civilization. So he's supposed to go figure out the boundaries of where he's going to live and the property. And then after he does that, then he's supposed to turn this wilderness into a functioning city. So he must have known from the O'Reilly census of 1770 that only 110 people lived on the river. Now, this is not including Native Americans, just the people that they were counting who would have been Spanish or whomever. So anybody that was probably of, they would have counted Spanish, French, English, and probably anybody that was of African descent. They would have counted those people. When he took his first census of 1783, he found 207. So there's almost 100 more people than what they were initially expecting. These were the people that he would attempt to reconvert to standards acceptable to a European-styled culture. Now, you gotta think, these fellas have left European culture. They don't want to have European culture. He's being told he's got to go create this new society. So on March 26, 1784, he informed Governor Miro that he had seen the four corners of the world, but he had never seen a Christian nation with a species of man similar to these here. Most of them lived as if they were in the Garden of Eden, which was to supply their every need and want with no restrictions, requirements, or demands. Filhiol came to abhor their living in a, quote, fantasy aside from the world. He wished to suppress these tendencies and encourage them to use their possessed professional skills. So with each succeeding letter, Filhiol expounded on the characteristics of his hunters. In his letter of September 1st, 1784, he said that they had no religious or moral character. They existed in a state worse than the savages. They had neither a hearth nor a local changing place. And for lodging, they used 6 raised poles covered with bark or hides for a roof, or with a few flexible poles and bear hides. Their beds consisted of bear hides, and clothing seemed to be their least concern, which means they're not dressed. In the summer, the men wore a braguette or a codpiece made from 1/3 of a yard of Limburg. So 1/3 of a yard, if you're a sewer, seamstress, not very much material, especially for a grown man. And the women wore rags. Their winter wardrobe consisted of roebuck hides, only partially cured. So they weren't even taking the time to totally cure the hides, and that's what they're wearing. So they're not people who are taking care of their families. For food, they ate animal meat, which lasted only half of a year, and they ate corn and pumpkins and melons. However, when they planted seed for a future harvest, the plants grew unattended and yielded only enough to sustain them for a short while. So they're not gardening well either. They're just planting some plants and just letting it ride. Filhiol lamented that they suffered from their habit, but the past never seemed to correct them for the future. So they are not learning from their decisions. So of these early colonists, the women created a matriarchy, which formed a bulwark against constant destructive forces. They were left alone for 6 or more months a year. I know there's women in our area that call themselves hunting widows because their husbands leave for long stretches of time. They had to be the protectors and providers for their families. Hunger of the young was a constant worry. Often in an effort to assuage hunger pains, they would put belts or leather straps around the children's stomachs and gradually tighten them to stifle the starving sensations. And when a woman had to be away from her child, she would use an ingenious substitute for a commercial pacifier to entertain him or her. A piece of bear or pork fat would be given to the child to suck. but only when the precaution had been taken to tie a leather string to the fat and the infant's big toe. If the child tried to swallow the tasty morsel and thereby choke himself, the first impulse would be to kick, and off goes the pork fat from its dangerous position. So, it's a great society. Ingenious, but maybe not thinking it through all the way. The harsh frontier living conditions caused hardship on the women and the children, but it is doubtful that all families had to live under such primitive circumstances. However, in 1784, when Filhiol wrote many of his descriptive passages about the living standards, he must have thought all had suffered so. At that time, he was using every possible means to get these erring people to recognize their pitiful state, which was so opposed to the well-being of society and themselves. He encouraged them to leave their camps and to move to good agricultural land between the Prairie de Cotte and Bayou Bartholomew and begin farming. In his October 1785 decree, he begged them to take up farming and plant tobacco for their economic support so they could make money. He must have expected little result from the entreaty. During the previous September 1784, he had stated that these colonists were accustomed to the hunting lifestyle and they were as unhappy as it may be. They will never change as long as they will be allowed to follow it. Filhiol knew that the hunters, living off the land as they did, destroyed the assets that could serve as a drawing card for future settlers. Had the Spanish authority allowed him to prohibit the hunting rights to a few capable men, the majority would have been forced to return to the arts and crafts from which they flee. So he's fussing because he's saying if they would just stop just everybody hunting constantly and only just have a few people who are good at hunting be the hunters, and then it would cause all the rest of the people who are not good at hunting to go back to the things that they knew how to do. So like they were like silversmiths, or they were, they were a cooper, like making wagon wheels and barrels, or they might have been a farmer. But whatever they were doing previously in France or in Spain, they completely were not doing that now. And so their families were starving because they were trying to live only off the land. Filhiol's right to require passports created problems with Commandant Etienne Devon of the Natchitoches Post. The latter complained to Governor Miro on August 20th, 1784, that the Ouachita commandant claimed too much territory in his jurisdiction. He was most upset that Filhiol would arrest the bear hunters who had not sought a paper from him, even though they carried passports issued by the commandant of a neighboring district. So he's arresting people for not having his personal permission, even though they had permission of other leaders in the area. Miro sustained Filhiol's action and commented that these papers were good for the general peace of the community in avoiding calamities that could happen without such a wise precaution. So Miro backs him up. However, the hunting restrictions prompted by the passports did not serve the Ouachita Post well, because few hunters turned to agriculture. They weren't going to start being farmers again. Filhiol lapsed into remorse over this failure and sought reassurances from Miro that he was functioning to the latter's satisfaction. So he's just trying to make sure, he's like, look, I can't make them change, but am I still doing a good job regardless? The passage of a few short years had shown Filhiol that the unpopular duties of a commandant set him apart from his contemporaries. His nearest neighbor was a league away upriver, and he never saw most of his people as they roamed through his 150 league dependents with no permanent homes, because they're just loose, hunting, chasing the animals. He was supposed to teach these nomadic souls about justice and law and introduce subordination. How could he, as they were travelers from all sorts of nations, the most part were fugitives, like they were probably criminals running from another nation. So they were living a life of the greatest independence, placing work in horror, knowing hardly if they were Christian, who will, when they find occasion, this is terrible though, When they find occasion, they make joy of incest, of whom several are accused assassins, to whom perjury, intoxication, and adultery passes niceness. These travelers he once identified as English, Flemish, Americans, Hungarians, Bohemians, Italians, and Germans. So basically, they're just living as a law unto themselves. They're definitely not living a life that someone would say you're living a godly life that follows scripture. So Filhiol claimed that he used firm patience in converting the Ouachita folk to a civilized behavior. What he could not do by admonition, by telling them that you have to do it, he tried to do by example, especially in farming. When he and De La Baume arrived in Prairie des Canots, they divided equally the high bluff overlooking the river. It took them 2 years to get ownership by grant from the Spanish crown, but in anticipation of that day, they had their slaves prepare trees and build their first cabins. So they're expecting to get the land, so they just go ahead and have their slaves go ahead and build and just assume that they're going to get that. With the completion of these plain but adequate houses, the pair turned to food production. Using land partially cleared by the Indians, they put the plow to the soil and planted frontier crops of corn, pumpkins, and melons for sustenance and tobacco for trade. In addition to being a farmer commandant, Filhiol tried to continue his Caddo Indian trade for the first 2 years. He erected a sizable trading post next to his house, but soon found that he would not have time to pursue the enterprise. In 1784, he sold his commercial rights, even though he needed the revenues, to help defray his command expenses and to make an effort to live on his 100 pesos yearly government salary. After demonstrating the honorable fashion in which a civilized person could pursue a vocation, he emphasized the importance of a family. He and Francois had a child in 1783, but as he wrote, he said God took the first infant a little after its birth. So they lost that first child. Then on March 24th, 1784, a year later, he happily wrote his friend Don Andres Lopez de Armesto, the government secretary in New Orleans, that his wife was pregnant by 7 months with the second infant since we have been on the Ouachita. Then he related what was to become legendary in the area, that the waters of this river have an admirable virtue for propagation. He advised that you and your beloved spouse should come here to drink. You will feel the effects assuredly. For once, Filhiol was full of praise for his command, not only for the aphrodisiacal quality of the water, but for the land, which was better than that near New Orleans. In 1784, Francois delivered a son while the couple were on the upper Ouachita attending a military muster. The boy was named Jean-Joseph, perhaps in honor of his uncle Jean-Joseph de La Baume. Marie Barbe, the only girl in the family, came on October 4th, 1786, and the last child, Edmond Landry Gramont, was born on June 10th, 1789. So in 1800, Vicente Fernandez Tejero y Cota replaced Filhiol, and he served in the last years of the Spanish regime. He left in 1804, and Ouachita was still a frontier and really almost still a virgin state. So Don Juan Filhiol was given a Spanish land grant of 200 acres to the Filhiol family. And there's a document signed by President James Buchanan in 1858 stating that the family indeed owned that land, which we now know is part of Logtown. And so I'll show a picture of that document from President James Buchanan. And then later we'll do another episode of Don Juan Filhiol's home out at Logtown, and we'll go into a little bit more detail in that. So in 1993, present day, the Daughters of the American Revolution And the West Monroe Historic Preservation Commission placed a marker on this property to show that this was property donated as a seat of justice by Don Juan Filhiol in 1816 out of his plantation from the Prairie des Canots. So he donated land, in which we'll talk more about this in other things, but he donated land for a courthouse, for schools. He was constantly donating towards the furtherment of Monroe as a city. And so anyway, there will be a picture of this marker, and this marker was in West Monroe, kind of down near where the railroad bridge, where you go under the railroad bridge. It was placed in that, near that area on the West Monroe side, but it was moved, and it was moved to the courthouse, and so now it sits in front of the courthouse in Monroe, and you can see that marker. You can take your kids to do that. If you do that, if you take your kids, take a picture and next to the marker and tag our page so that we can see that you went and visited that marker. So anyway, hope y'all have a great day, and we will talk to you later. Bye.